The legal strategies previously discussed, operating a second line of business and throwing everything you can into COGS, have proven to work but have created no lasting impact on the industry. It appears it will take legislative action to fix this problem. I suggest Congress should modernize Section 280E to better align with the drafter's intent to deter illegal drug use and to better align with today's legal cannabis markets. In this section of the podcast, we are going to talk about how Congress can deter drug use and raise revenue by reforming Section 280E. At the core, cannabis business owners want to pay state and federal taxes. Maintaining a strong working relationship with the IRS legitimizes the industry and in turn makes the industry more sustainable and normalizes it. The current tax regime forces cannabis businesses to either risk ignoring Section 280E on their tax filing or forego paying taxes altogether because the costs are just so expensive. Now, ignoring Section 280E forces these businesses to gamble on maybe the IRS overlooking their tax filing, and foregoing paying taxes altogether, their second option, evaporates their revenues. Congress can solve this problem in one of two ways. They could either amend the Controlled Substances Act or amend Section 280E itself. First, let's talk about amending the Controlled Substances Act. The primary reason why state legal cannabis businesses are required to comply with 280E is because cannabis, their product, is a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law. If Congress amended the CSA to include an exception for state legal cannabis businesses, that would alleviate this big tax burden the cannabis business owners face. This reform is the heart of the 10th Amendment through Entrusting States Act, aka the States Act. The States Act is proposed by Senators Cory Gardner, Republican out of Colorado, and Elizabeth Warren, Democrat out of Massachusetts. Now, essentially, the States Act amends the CSA so long as the cannabis business complies with state law, the CSA provisions would no longer apply to the business. If enacted, the CSA would be rendered essentially inapplicable to state legal cannabis businesses, thus making 280E also inapplicable to the business. Now, under the States Act, selling cannabis would not trigger Section 280E because businesses in compliance with state cannabis laws would not be in violation of the CSA and therefore would not be trafficking in controlled substance, which is the main trigger for Section 280E to apply to your business. Remember, 280E transitioned the question from the legality of the source to the legality of the business, which in this case, cannabis businesses under federal law traffic controlled substances. But the States Act would render the CSA, the federal law in this case, inapplicable to cannabis companies who abide by state law. Now, the States Act does not make cannabis federally legal or even reschedule or decriminalize it. But the act gives state legal cannabis businesses a fair chance to compete, allow the full development of state markets, and gives these businesses the freedom to avail themselves of tax benefits and modern accounting regulations that are currently denied to them. The States Act also allows states who want to move forward in the industry a chance to compete in the global market. With states like California having the 6th largest economy in the world, becoming a global player is a realistic option for states like that. The drafters of the States Act understand the ambiguity. That ambiguity in general is an obstacle to cannabis businesses when filing taxes. This is why they included additional provisions in the Act to make it absolutely clear that statutes like Section 280E are not triggered. The rule of construction, if you will, provides that conduct in compliance with the Act, quote, shall not be unlawful, and 2, shall not constitute trafficking in controlled substance under the CSA. The States Act straight up calls out the CSA. Just to make it absolutely clear, do not apply 280E to these businesses. Now, opponents of this approach would argue a more effective way to alleviate cannabis businesses from the burdens of 280E is to deschedule cannabis entirely from the CSA. Descheduling cannabis from the CSA would automatically remove cannabis businesses from the scope of 280E 100%, because cannabis would no longer be a Schedule 1 controlled substance. Section 280E would not apply because the language specifically applies to businesses, quote, trafficking Schedule 1 substances. In January of 2019, Representative Earl Blumenauer filed House Resolution 420, which adopts this approach. His bill removes cannabis from the CSA and establishes a nationally regulated industry overseen by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. His approach, which is to regulate cannabis like alcohol, is a compelling idea, and some states are already doing it, but descheduling cannabis from the CSA is politically, in my opinion, impractical. While most lawmakers seem to tolerate a medical program in their state, it's actually inaccurate to suggest they are in favor of legalizing cannabis federally for adults 21 and over. Going from the harshest classification to complete freedom that quickly just seems unlikely. Moreover, descheduling is so abrupt and would change so many things at once. It would end federal prohibition, thus leaving regulation of cannabis up to the states, and it would allow interstate commerce. It would introduce a new industry that many people are still skeptical of. Now, feasibly speaking, the States Act is a more realistic solution because it provides a solution set in the middle. The States Act would satisfy the opponents of federal legalization while giving state legal cannabis businesses a chance to operate on a level playing field. States' rights is the central idea of the States Act, and I think that would carry the day in Congress. Both sides of the aisle would be satisfied with that. Descheduling cannabis is a compelling idea and would immediately solve the problem, yes, but I just think it's too abrupt. Now, the second option is to amend Section 280E itself. Check this out. This approach is the heart of the Small Business Tax Equity Act of 2017. The legislation would essentially exempt cannabis businesses acting in compliance with state law from Section 280E, thereby allowing these businesses to take the ordinary business deductions offered to all other industries in the country. Under this act, Section 280E would read as normal, which we've gone over the plain text earlier in the pod, but it would include this quote at the end, quote, unless such trade or business consists of cannabis sales conducted in compliance with state law. So they essentially would have 280E still in place, but they would create an exemption for state law abiding cannabis businesses. This reform under the Small Business Tax Act more narrowly addresses the unfair impact of Section 280E has on states with regulated cannabis markets without doing an entire overhaul of United States cannabis policy. But the future is not certain for this act. It hasn't moved since its introduction into Congress in 2017, but I think it's worth talking about. Congress had the opportunity to address Section 280E 2 years ago when they enacted the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act into law, 3 years ago. But as I said, the bill didn't repeal Section 280E or even amend it. But the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act does help owners of cannabis businesses that operate in pass-through form, so like LLCs, partnerships, sole proprietorships, and S-corps with Section 199A. Now, under 199A, these businesses can deduct up to 20% of its taxable income. Thus, for cannabis business owners affected by 280E, the deduction is actually quite significant. 80% of the disallowed deductions, they're still there, but a 20% reduction would help their tax burden. Now, to kind of wrap up this podcast, I'd like to say that tax neutrality is based on the primary goal to raise revenue, not discriminate against certain group of taxpayers. Section 280E is a non-neutral tax policy that punishes state legal businesses by denying them the benefits that, quite frankly, are required for survival in the American economy. Non-neutral tax policy is effective when it halts or hinders activities that are in opposition to public policy. But such policies can be problematic if they're not narrowly tailored and out of date with current markets. As on its face, Section 280E right now, with the current state of cannabis in the United States, it's written too broadly for today's market. Section 280E hurts taxpayers that try to comply with the law. It prevents the cannabis industry from giving patients the medicine they need, and 280E is indirectly subsidizing the illicit market. But change is possible. The 115th Congress made changes at the federal level when it enacted the 2018 Farm Bill. The 116th Congress will continue to change the federal treatment of cannabis, and continuing on under Biden's administration. State markets generate impressive revenues. Recently, Michigan announcing over $40 million in cannabis sales within 4 months of implementing their adult use market. Public support for Section 280E and the federal enforcement against the business is unpopular, and cannabis businesses should stand for it no longer. I think as a society, the United States is moving in the right direction, but the biggest challenge is to bring the federal government's head out of the sand. There's a lot more revenues to be collected, and a lot more investment to be had, and a lot more patients to help.